Thank you. The story of my involvement with Richard Kim's The Martyred is, I think, best told by my foreword. And so I'd like to read it to you and then actually add a few additional personal thoughts about the book and about the author that I didn't, in the end, incorporate into the foreword because they felt a little too personal for the foreword, but I think that they might be appropriate tonight. So first, for the foreword, which I was so honored to be asked to write, and also so frightened and dismayed to be asked to write, which I think will be made clear when I read it. In the fall of 1998, after a reading I had given in Manhattan, and I should add that it was a reading from my first novel, The Foreign Student, which is set during the Korean War, an older gentleman, gray-haired, in a suit, approached the table at which I was signing copies of my novel for a procession of well-wishers who were mostly my friends or the friends of my friends. This man was neither, and he bent toward me with a hesitant formality. He had been, he said, some 3 decades before, a sales representative for George Brazeler, publisher of The Martyred by Richard E. Kim. I knew the book, surely. A hot flush of fraudulence lighting my cheeks, I assured him I did. By this lie, he was visibly gratified. Of course I would know it. Given that Kim had been the first true Korean-American writer, and one of such prominence, thunderously praised for The Martyred, comfortably lodged for 5 months on the New York Times bestseller list of 1964, nominated for the National Book Award, compared to Bellow, admired by Roth, and given that I was now a Korean-American writer myself, he had expected I'd know the book well, that it would have unique meaning for me. Then he pressed a first edition in my hands. I took it home and put it on a shelf where it remained, unread, accreting emotions of inadequacy and guilt, particular to it, but applicable to many other realms in my life, for the next 12 years. Perhaps it was inevitable, given this introduction, that I would attempt to dismiss Richard Kim as the sort of overbearing older relation one wants to avoid. All these years walking around with a Korean last name, scribbling and publishing stories, and now just as success is in reach, this grandfather whom no one has ever mentioned turns out to have done it all first and is crashing the party. Richard E. Kim had never been discussed at the Asian American Reading Group. He had never appeared on the syllabus. But all this petulant casting of blame veiled my shocked insecurity. I had just spent the better part of a decade researching a novel about the Korean War, yet here was the groundbreaking work on the subject, and I'd never heard of it. History offers some clues as to why. After publishing 3 works of fiction in only 6 years, from 1970 to the end of his life in 2009, Kim never published a novel again. In the post-woman warrior era in which I grew up, enthralled by identity politics, Kim was certainly well out of style. But I preferred other explanations for my ignorance. I was a bad daughter who never tried hard enough. Kim was a bad father, almost certainly, was I guessing or hoping, a practitioner of fussy, florid, dated prose, all of which were related. All my explanations had to do with relatedness itself, with my confused Koreanness, and Richard Kim's. I consigned Richard Kim to my menagerie of family problems. Even up to accepting the invitation to provide this foreword, I continued to relegate Kim in this way. Like the journey abroad that will force one to visit that doddering aunt to whom one never writes, writing this foreword would force me to belatedly fulfill my obligation to Kim. And so it was the bad daughter who sat down to read, a 12 years late by her own estimation, but merely a reader who stood up some 5 hours later in a state of most potent elation, all prejudgments of the book and its author dynamited to dust. Richard E. Kim's The Martyred is no more about the Korean War than Antigone is about the Civil War in Thebes. Such utilitarian preoccupation with subject matter as I was guilty of before reading The Martyred. It's about the Korean War, I have to read it, it might contain some little fact about jeeps I don't already know, denigrates the work of art as surely as particular attention to the author's ethnicity denigrates the author. The work of art need not be about anything because it's about everything. In The Martyred, Kim forges a drama of such devastating universality that an electrifying sense of recognition binds us to the page. And the universality of the novel is not merely a happy accident of its aesthetic success. Clearly, Kim meant this as a fundamental aspect of its design. Though this is a novel of war, Kim steers clear of combat, limiting his settings almost entirely to interiors, and his characters to men of letters, whether they be pastors, military intelligence officers, or military propagandists. Though this is a novel of the war in Korea, notorious for the seesawing chaos of its lines, which lurched up and down the full length of the peninsula with such frequency and rapidity that those in the rear would find themselves abruptly ahead of the front, and vice versa, Kim chooses the sustained, and as it would turn out, highly uncharacteristic lull of the late fall of 1950, before China entered the conflict. His characters, at their desks, on their cots, are allowed to stay put. They stoke fires. They brew tea. They attend briefings. And hardly before we've seen it coming, they embroil themselves and us in a conflict of principles so urgent and so impossible to solve, the very muscles of our souls ache from the effort. Though this is a novel of Korea, specifically of Pyongyang just before it is abandoned by the United States and its allies to the communist forces, Kim blankets scene after scene beneath a slashing, stinging, blinding, numbing snowfall, with the result that every physical particularity, every distinguishing detail is erased. The choice earned him vitriol in Korea for being inaccurate. Pyongyang received no snowfall in 1950. But these critics were missing the point. Of course, this is Korea and Koreans, Kim is telling his readers. And of course, whoever and wherever you are, this is your society and you. Throughout his life, which had begun in Japanese-occupied Korea and survived a civil war, before concluding in an adopted homeland where he achieved prominence writing in his third language, Kim implied to interviewers that he never felt entirely at home. Perhaps the existential purity of The Martyred to some extent arises from this unease, from Kim's reluctance, conscious or not, to author a novel too Korean or too soldierly. Yet I doubt it. Nowhere does this novel waver with uncertainty. In Kim's prose, not a word or phrase fails in its task. At one point near the end, I felt the walls of my throat growing thick with emotion and tears flooding my eyes, but was so immersed in the stream of the story I couldn't pinpoint what had provoked my upsurge of emotion. I went back and reread. A cool breeze drifted toward the land from the darkening sea. The long shadow of a flagpole stretched up the sloping garden. The grass felt chilly against my palms. It had been that cold grass against the narrator's palms that had moved me to tears. For it had been such a long, grueling winter, so full of death for both bodies and souls, that to feel a touch of life against the skin was almost overwhelming. This is a writer in perfect control of his craft, who can move us to tears by the touch of a grass blade. How humbling to reflect that The Martyred was Kim's first book, but how wonderful, as the erstwhile bad daughter, to find that here is no neglected grandpa at all, but a master and masterpiece. So I came up with this conceit of the bad daughter and the unwanted grandfather for the foreword, and it worked pretty well, and it did convey my really complicated feelings of utter idiocy that I didn't know about this writer. I had heard of him. I'd always heard of him. He'd always been part of the background. But somehow, during the period of my education at Yale, where I actually avoided actual literature and just read literary theory, which was a terrible mistake, and then later at Cornell, when I tried to atone for that mistake by actually reading books, Richard Kim wasn't, as I say, on the syllabus. I remember belonging to an Asian American literary group. We were sort of a book club. And we were all graduate students and professors who felt that we just didn't understand enough about Asian American literature, and we all wanted to redress our ignorance by joining together to read books like The Woman Warrior, like, oh gosh, now I'm blanking out on the wonderful book by Louis Chu, but a whole range of books by Frank Chin, by Louis Chu, No No Boy, other classics of Asian American literature that we felt we were really remiss in not being familiar with. And The Martyred was not on that list. And I start to talk a little bit in the foreword about why. It does remain a mystery to me, though. And so this conceit of being the bad daughter was something that I developed, but it was actually standing in for another aspect of my fascination with Richard Kim, because once I agreed to do the foreword, Elda approached me, and I was so flattered, and as I say, really frightened, because I felt completely inadequate for the task. But here was a chance to redeem myself, perhaps. I started reading about Richard Kim, and one of the things that was stunning to me was that he really wasn't a grandpa figure to me at all, but a father figure. His life is so full of parallels to my own father's life that I feel compelled to mention them here because they mean a lot to what I bring to the book personally, although I didn't feel that they quite had a place in the foreword. Richard Kim and my father were born 367 days apart. My father in March of 1931, Richard Kim in March of 1932. They were from very similar family backgrounds, a certain amount of affluence and landowning and memories of actually orchards with fruit trees seem to have figured in both of their lives. All my childhood, my father would tell me stories of the places in Korea his family had lost. There were always apple trees and pear trees in these places. And this terrible sense of dispossession that steeped all of my father's recollections when he shared them with me, which was infrequently because he didn't like to. Richard Kim and my father both came to the U.S. in the mid-1950s. My father came in 1955. Richard Kim either came in 1954 or 55. I've found both dates. They both came to attend college in the U.S. because they had both had their college education interrupted by the outbreak of war. They both, I think, I at least can speak for my father, felt all their lives a sense of being stuck in between. My father, like Richard Kim, grew up in Japanese-occupied Korea. He had a Japanese name. He spoke the Japanese language. He had deep ambivalence. To this day, he has deep ambivalence about Japan, a nation he loves, a culture and a language he loves. My father is a one-man compendium of information on Japanese film, Japanese art, Japanese history and culture, and yet there's this terrible tension because of the history of the two nations. And reading Richard Kim, I felt as if I was reading, in a way I felt as if I was reading my father if my father's mind had worked that way instead of having been a mathematician's mind, because my father's not a verbal guy, he's a numbers guy. And so for all these reasons, I did form a very personal connection to this work, and those reasons are added to the admiration I felt for the work as a writer. I just want to really quickly read the first paragraph of The Martyred, and then talk about why, as a writer, I thought this was so great, the way he begins the novel. The war came early one morning in June of 1950, and by the time the North Koreans occupied our capital city, Seoul, we had already left our university, where we were instructors in the history of human civilization. I joined the Korean Army, and Park volunteered for the Marine Corps, the proud combat outfit that suited his temperament. In a short time, because junior officers died very fast in the early phase of the war, we were trained and battle-tested, and we both became officers. We survived, but we were both wounded. The shrapnel of a mortar shell had grazed my right knee during the defense of Daegu, and a sniper had shot Park in his left arm in the mopping-up operation in Seoul after the Incheon landing. We both spent some time in the hospital, were both promised medals, and were returned promptly to our respective duties. That's the first paragraph. I was stunned when I read this paragraph as a writer myself, because I felt that an entire novel could have been written about the events elucidated so clearly, in a way so tersely, but it's a terseness that's extremely compelling to me as a voice. I couldn't understand how Richard Kim had figured out how to do that. As a writer, my struggle is always to figure out how to say more with less. And I was amazed by this style in which he was able to convey so much and in such a wonderful, dry way. They're instructors in the history of human civilization. How ironic that will prove to be. And I found that it was also just remarkable that he had the confidence as a first-time novelist to pass over all of these events that he mentions, to get onto his real story, which isn't a story of combat or shrapnel or medals, but really an absolutely timeless story of religious faith, religious disillusionment, loyalty, and principles. So in this way, Richard Kim also became something of a teacher to me when I read The Martyred, because as a writer, I err on the side of talking too much. As a person, I do the same. I'm about to stop and ask you to ask me questions. And I felt that I had so much to learn from his style, which I admire so enormously, its spareness and its power. And with that, I would like to stop talking and ask for your questions. And there's one already. I'm not sure what format we're looking for.
Thank you, Susan. First, can we get a round of applause for the wonderful commentary? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just because the wireless handheld cuts out of our recording, we'd really love you to get up here and just say your name and where you're from, and please ask your questions. Thank you.
I'm Penelope Kim, and I just want to say that without a doubt, my husband would have embraced you as a very good daughter.
Thank you. That's very reassuring.
Excuse me, my name is, sorry, my name is Cambria. I'm a member of the Society. I just want to say about a forgotten name, a lost name, as Kim's last book says. There is no loanable copy in the New York Public Library of The Martyr, nor any of Kim's book. I am at a college in the CUNY system. The CUNY system does not even have a copy, which says how forgotten he is. My question is, and I'm sorry, I don't wish to embarrass you, Madam Kim, is that do you feel that after 1970 and being away from Korea, that Richard Kim dried up as a novelist or became quiet and stopped writing? Because The Lost Name, the second novel, I won't say what my opinion is, but his Lost Names is quite striking. And for a while, I know in the university system, it was used as a book to be read.
I would love, if Penelope wanted to address that question, I would love for her answer. because of course, as a writer, I wonder too. I know that Richard Kim remained very active to the end of his life with a whole slew of projects in other genres. If you want to speak to that.
Well, most importantly, we'd like to thank Penguin Classics and Elder for having this book reissued, because it has been dormant for many years. And I think there will be an audience and an interest, and that is why I'm so excited that it's coming out in this new edition. Lost Names has enjoyed and still enjoys a very active life. It's published by UCal Berkeley. There's just a 40th anniversary edition released this month, and it's been used a lot in high schools and in college courses, not ones that all of us had participated in, but it has had a very long and happy life. My husband, after those 3 novels, intended to write one more, but got involved, and it wasn't so much as being away from Korea, but it was reintegrating himself in different ways. We started a literary agency which allowed him to convince the publishers in Korea to honor copyrights for the first time. They had been pirating like Taiwan had. And because of his knowledge of the American industry and publishers and his knowledge of the Koreans, he sort of shamed them into contracting for books. So that was a real interest, book related, and he hoped they would only publish classics. But there was a great demand for Rosemary Pilcher, is that her name? Or
Rosamund.
some rather frivolous subjects in his estimation. But then he did a number of broadcasts for Korean broadcast, KBS Society. And he was able, because of his American passport, to travel places where some of his Korean colleagues couldn't. So he did Trans-Siberian Railway in search of Koreans that had been scattered across the Soviet Union. He went into Manchuria. There are quite a few of those kinds of things that he was engaged in. So I think while those things didn't turn out to be something we read, there were some ongoing and pretty interesting activities. And the Trans-Siberian Railroad was spoken in 3 different languages because everyone on board there was speaking something else, and they were translating for each other, and it's 5 hours long, and I can't tell you when I last saw it.
I am a retired professor of American literature, and Richard Kim and I were very close friends. And I have the Martyred and Lost names both autographed by Richard Kim. So if anybody is interested in looking at these old books. Also, I have 2 books Richard Kim wrote in Korean, and both autographed, of course. And if anybody is interested in looking at those 2 books, I have them at home. And I thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Are we going to discuss about the author more details later? Or this is the only chance?
Let's do it now.
My English is not so great. I wish I could speak in Korean. No, okay. I read it I'm not sure it's the Korean translated one or English. Years ago, maybe middle of 1970. But then I heard this published. So I heard it read again. And it was still so powerful. And I had so many questions about this Mr. Kim, how he could write such a novels, like such a religious questions and thoughts, and the war conditions. I mean, briefly speaking. So how did he get those materials while he is here? And what is his background of religious, aspect? Like he was Christian, or his parents was religious people, and what is his life work as a lived with as a Christians or anything else? Anything more details? Because in 1970, and this book, quickly, I just tried to read quickly, because I just got this book. Did not have much details about Mr. Kim, about those aspects. Mm-hmm. The Chang, Professor Chang, I think Chang, that he had introduction, but mainly about the English, the word and phrases, etc. He did not write on his introduction in 1969 publication about the author. So I would appreciate as much as you can.
Sure, yeah. I was going to say, my understanding of Richard Kim's biographical background almost entirely comes from materials that I read and Professor Fenkel's really excellent introduction in this edition, but given that we have the luxury of Richard Kim's family, I think that we're going to have to put them on stage again just to talk a little about maybe the family's religious background.
We'll just say that he was born in North Korea, grew up there, and came to the South when the communists came into the North. He was able, with the rest of the family, in separate ways, to escape into the South. As the war broke out, he had been about to start college classes, but the war broke out and he was in the Korean Army during the duration of the Korean War, after which people arranged for him to come to college in the United States. So he came in 1955, and the reminiscence of your father, his father had an apple orchard in the north, and they grew apples that they wrapped for the Emperor of Japan, not with any loving care, but there was the royal insignia on the papers that the apples were wrapped in. But those are things that appear more in lost names. So as far as, let me just say, how did he write in the style he did? It could be easily said that it was because this was a third language and he didn't know more words, but I don't think that was really it. He claimed to have more of a visual or he could visualize scenes, and he wasn't a very talkative person, would you say, except on certain occasions. But I think that was probably the reason for the more austere style, that he envisioned scenes and then could write without too much elaboration, because he could condense the view he had of those scenes. Is that enough? Would you like to know about his sister? And
Do you think she was able to illuminate his life as a young man, how this religious, I think that's what you're asking, how he developed his philosophy and his view of the world?
Yeah. Grandfather was a Christian minister, which is where the background came from, but he was not a church-going person in later life. But that was a part of the family upbringing. Mother played the piano, and I'm sure and one really interesting anecdote, we went out to dinner not too many years ago. The first Korean restaurant in the area of Amherst where we lived opened, and they are very religious, and they were playing music, and there were hymns, and he started singing them in Korean, and I started singing them in English, and we had both grown up that far apart, but knowing the same Christian hymns.
Hi, I'm John Kim. Thank you for your introduction remarks. She answered a part of my question that he served in the South Korean army. So probably his experience during the war was incorporated into this book. By the way, I haven't read his book yet, but I'm just curious. What was his attitude toward the Korean War? Did he perceive it as a civil war, or just a part of international aggression by the communist forces that was presented by the United States government at that time, and whether he had a chance to visit his hometown later in his life. Thank you.
Again, it's a question that I really can't answer.
I think you could say the feeling was of communist aggression. The communists had taken over the homeland, and those were the aggressors. He did not have a chance to visit. I don't think he really wanted to visit, because he still saw it as a communist-controlled country. As you have mentioned, he did grow up under the Japanese occupation and had the same feelings as your father about Japanese people, although we did begin to purchase the cameras, and it took a while, but he finally broke down. But just to explain about the father, when my husband was leaving after the war to come to college in America, this family, I'm going to say, was not insular, is what I'm trying to say. And the father said, you know, now you're going off. We don't know when. It took 2 months on a boat. It wasn't an instant, flight in those days. You're going off. We don't know when we'll see you again. You're a young man. You may want to get married. You can marry anyone you want as long as she's not Japanese.
Susan, I have one question for you. What is it in his writings, do you think, that makes critics refer to him in the same sentence as a Dostoevsky or Camus or something like that? What is it that you find that rings true in that?
I think it's the intensity of the philosophical and existential questioning that he manages to achieve in the book. The book turns on questions of not just religious faith, who has it and who doesn't, but also the utility of faith, the utility of deception and duplicity. And it's extraordinarily absorbing for a reader. I mean, I found myself, I think one of the amazing things about the book is that he does create this extremely challenging moral, ethical relativism where almost everyone in the book, although they're very opposed in their principles, almost everyone, as they speak or as they sort of enact their individual view of their individual kind of ethical view of life, everyone is compelling, and you feel that everyone is acting on a very valid philosophical approach to the difficult problems of the world, and yet these different approaches are extremely opposed. So that on the one hand, there's the argument that that honesty matters above all else, and the young captain in the book who's charged with discovering the truth about an incident, a number of ministers are murdered in cold blood, and he goes out to discover the truth of this, and to put it very simply, you would think, well, the truth, that's a good thing, right? We should know what the truth is. The people should know, the public should know, the truth should emerge. But as the story goes on, it becomes clear that the truth isn't necessarily the best thing, and that perhaps actually a systematic deception is better in some way, is more ethical. It's a very complicated issue. And I think as a reader, you find yourself unable to take sides easily, because you can understand almost everyone's actions, even when the characters' actions are utterly antithetical to each other. And I think in that way, it did remind me a lot of my experience of reading Crime and Punishment, for example. When you're reading Crime and Punishment, and morals and ethics that seem as if they should be very straightforward actually become very complicated and very, very difficult and thorny to sort out, because in both cases the authors do such a good job of dramatizing the human need and the human intention, and these things just aren't simple. And I think also his use of Camus is much more overt. Again, Professor Fenkel's really excellent introduction lays out the way in which Albert Camus was really a very clear influence on the book and on Richard Kim's thinking. And a lot of that has to do with Camus' idea of the absurd, which isn't the absurd, ha ha, how funny, but the absurd as Camus sort of tried to explain it, which is this idea of kind of a fundamental irreconcilability of different elements in our lives, that there isn't this easy answer. It turns out that the truth actually isn't necessarily what sets us free, that kind of problem. Camus, I think, was trying to unpack that, and Richard Kim wants to get at those issues too, things that you can't really, there are no villains in the book at all. And I think for a book about war and suffering, that's very challenging and really exciting for the reader, that there are no villains. You never sort of get onto the communist side, but you can imagine that if he were to have written a novel in which there were protagonists on the opposite side of the battle lines, we would have probably understood them well too, and found them compelling and sympathetic also.
We'll take one or two more questions or comments if there are any. Anyone? Okay, we have one.
Hi, my name is George. I'm a member of the Korea Society, and if not for the Korea Society, I also wouldn't have known about this book. But through your work, can you hypothesize why this is like a lost novel? Like the reasoning behind it?
Why it's what kind
It's
of
like a
novel?
lost novel, like, you know, that so many people don't know about it? Like why it's laid dormant?
It's a great question.
And then after you
Yeah.
respond, maybe the family could? Yes.
Definitely. I would love, I would love Penelope's insight again because, like I say, I was born in 1969, so a year before Lost Names was published, and I came of age in the 80s. I was, being a bad daughter, I spent a lot of my time in college avoiding things Korean. But then in graduate school, I spent a lot of time trying to refamiliarize myself with those things, and it was just not there. And I think one reason is actually political fashion. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think, and without offending anyone, because these are great books, but I do refer to the sort of post-woman warrior era of literary studies, and I feel that the literary studies sensibility that I came of age with was very much about ethnic identity and the specificity of ethnic identity, and different Asian American writers of different descents writing about the specificity of what it meant to be Chinese living in Berkeley, or what it meant to be, Korean living here, and that there was this enormous preoccupation with blood and roots and family and all things that are important. But one of the things that I found so liberating about Richard Kim's book was that I felt it really transcended it transcends his background, it transcends its own setting. It is very much, to me, a philosophical novel in the tradition of Camus, who, of course, was a French Algerian, but whose writing speaks to everyone. And I felt that this novel spoke to everyone. And I think there was just something a bit. There was a tendency toward being obsessed with identity politics when I was studying literature as a college student, and I don't think that Richard Kim's book fits well with that tendency, which is, I think, one of its great strengths, actually. Not to denigrate those works at all, but I know that as a Korean American writer, I always felt irritated by the implication that I should write only about what it meant to be of Korean descent and not about other issues that might affect all humans. So I think that there's something in his work that was unfashionable in the 70s and 80s. And that's my best guess as to how this book fell so far beneath the radar. I don't know if Penelope has another sort of theory.
It was amazing that it had the success it did when it was first published. It was rejected by 12 publishers. He'd had a contract with Doubleday, which was amazing. But then they said, gee, I think you should put some women in to make it more interesting. And thank goodness he said, well, no. And everyone said, oh, you can't give up a contract for your first book. He didn't. And then we, watched The Mail for a year and a half, and then Brazilla did indeed publish it. And the fact that it became a bestseller and was read and had huge attention in Korea, 14 foreign editions, that was amazing, because even then, it's not a book that you would think would be that popular. I refer you to Heinz Frankel, his essay, which does begin to address some of the questions he does address the questions about time. And in this country, we were going through identity in literature, we were going through post-Vietnam, we were going through political, we've moved into political correctness and all, and this is a book with, Christian ministers. And it just wasn't something that people were reading. And so I had one other point, but I've lost it. So I think that we'll see how many, how it speaks to people now. And I think that this gap has been good. I think we're at a different point in our history. Oh, my other point was that the Korean War got forgotten in this country. I mean, people did go off to war and came back, but no one paid much attention to it. It wasn't until after Vietnam that we began to really understand what our soldiers had gone through. And the people who fought in that war, the Americans, were largely forgotten. So I think that's just part of the history of the book as well.
Okay, well, would you please join me in thanking Susan
Thank
and
you.
also,
And also Penelope.
Richard Kim's family who's here tonight. It's really been such a special evening and so valuable for all of us to have you here especially. So thank you for coming. I'd just like to, not, for shameless advertising, but I'd just like to let you know that we are having a special screening at the MoMI this Sunday. We're going to be showing Duman River. It's about crossing borders, about North Korean refugees going through to the Chinese territory. It's really a really great movie. So I'd encourage you to go out and support us. It's at 7 p.m. And then next Thursday we have a Kayegun performance set to Pyeonggu, part of the court music series that we have here. But thank you all for coming out tonight. Please help yourself to some refreshments in the back, and thank you again. Thank you.